question of citizenship. Obviously, there's a technical legal meaning to the term citizenship, but in this point in history, that's not really what the word means. Right, so the Republican model was equal, virtuous citizens governing themselves, the Athenian city-state model. It's critically important that they all be equal to each other. It's critically important that they all be virtuous. It's small, homogeneous, right? All the stuff we talked about in looking at the Anti-Federalists last time. One of the implications of that model is that barriers of entry to become a citizen, meaning someone entitled to participate in the governing of the city, or the state, barriers to entry to that status are high. It's not something that, for example, happens automatically. In the United States, with the adoption of the 14th Amendment, we have what's called birthright citizenship. After the 14th Amendment, anyone born in the United States is a U.S. citizen. That's very different from the old Republican model, which, for example, Machiavelli said you had to serve in the military before you could be a citizen. Right? You had to do service to the common good, and in that way you earned your entitlement to be a participant in the processes of government. The Federalist version, as we're going to see today, is very, very different. Even though that specific question of citizenship doesn't come up as explicitly here, but the Federalist vision is much more inclusive and much more pluralistic. The problem with either model, and it doesn't matter which one you choose, is the circular, it's the chicken egg problem of democracy. Who gets to define the demos in the first place? You can't ask the people to define the people, right? You say, everybody vote on who gets to be the people, who gets to vote. Well, and I have to answer that question. There isn't a good way out of this. I mean, I'll just tell you right now. Political theorists have talked about this for generations. There are various attempts to try and resolve the question, but if we start with the premise that the people are the source of legitimate authority, government by consent of the people, we have to ask, who are the people? And no matter how you answer that question, let me just throw this out as an idea for you to contemplate. I suggest to you that no matter how you answer that question, you end up with a kind of brute historical fact that at some moment, enough people accepted the definition that was offered to make it stick. It's basically just force. From there, going forward, the question becomes, how do we legitimate? How do we describe a government form as legitimate? And that's where the Constitution comes in. But there is this lurking question in the background. We talked about this in the context of the Declaration of Independence. Who's signing it? Who is the people being represented? And the way you answer that question can't be resolved by looking, for example, to the Constitution, because anything in the Constitution that answers that question itself has to be justified somehow. So there is this foundational question. Who are the people? If you're a romantic nationalist, like a 19th century German writer, there are lots of other romantic nationalists around the world, but Germany in the 19th century is considered the place where this really gets going in a big way. If you're a romantic nationalist, then you argue that there's an organic, natural meaning to the people, like a tribe. And you have some set of definitions, shared culture or shared genetics or right, being related to each other in the case of a clan. Or so, you insist that it's a natural unit. And that is one approach, but neither in this in this Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment way of thinking, neither Republicans nor liberals, nor work ethic Protestants, none of the participants in these debates really focused on the idea of a people as a natural object that was always there. I mentioned this, there's a hint of that in the Declaration of Independence, right? One of the course of human events, one people, and the political bonds that tie it to another. So the peoples were there before or separate from the political bonds, but it's really just a hint. So keep your eye on that question of who gets to be the citizens. And the way that one of the ways that will show up, it's going to show up lots of ways, I mean, particularly when we start dealing with slavery, obviously, because people who are owned as property are not citizens in any philosophical or legal sense of the term. That goes without saying, right? To be a citizen is to be entitled to certain prerogatives, rights, depending on your system, certain rights attached to being a full-fledged member of the people And that word citizen is sometimes used to mean that. It's sometimes used in a more technical legal way. We'll come back to the question. I just wanted to plant the thought as something to keep your eye on as we go forward. All right. So last time we looked at the anti-federalist concerns about the Constitution. They focused on a concern about the loss of sovereignty by the states, the fear of an overweening national government that would take too much power, a specific concern that courts, under the provisions of the Constitution establishing the federal courts, that courts would have a sweeping mandate to interpret both the spirit as well as the letter of the Constitution, and in so doing would, the word of Sentinel, liberally grant powers to the national government, would read the text in that liberal, meaning generous sense of the term. And more generally, that you simply can't have a republic, small, virtuous, homogeneous, self-governing, over the kind of scale of the United States. It contradicts all sense, all older philosophy, specifically Montesquieu, as I mentioned, is a guy who gets mentioned a lot in this discussion. And the solution, therefore, must be a confederation of republics, where each of the states will be a republic, but the nation as a whole will be a treaty organization, somewhat like the modern EU. The Federalists, this is their response. And the fundamental Federalist response, we're going to go, as you have seen, if you look at the notes on the outline, there's a lot of specific points that we're going to look at today. But the fundamental overall Federalist response is, we're doing something new. The lessons of European history it's called American exceptionalism. What we're doing here is new and different. The lessons of European history do not apply to us. The lessons of antiquity do not apply to us. Because we here in America are doing this new thing, a new science of politics. All right, so to begin with, Federalist 1, Hamilton responds in sort of very general, it's the first essay after all, in very general and philosophical terms to the anti-federalist fear of an overly powerful national government. And Hamilton's answer, which is very, very Lockean, this is classic Locke, is that government is the only security for liberty. So in the Lockean social contract model, the basic model of liberalism, right, where you enter into society and give up certain natural rights in order to have the security provided by the government, governments exist to protect us in the first place from each other. So we're not constantly stealing from each other or doing violence to each other. External enemies and internal enemies. That's the basic Lockean model. You give up some of your natural liberty in order to have security. Security against what? The violence of others who might not respect your rights because you have no enforcement mechanism for them. And in Hamilton's view, that's exactly the point. A strong government is not the antithesis of liberty, it's the only way to secure liberty. It will be forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty. I'm sorry. The microphone's sitting right here and I'm not using it. That was dumb. Is this working? Okay, and it's better with a mic, right? Oh, sorry about that. I'm used to clipping it on, but that one isn't working today. It will be forgotten that the vigor of government is essential to the security of liberty, and that a dangerous ambition more often lurks behind the specious mask of zeal for the rights of the people than under the forbidden appearance of zeal for the firmness and efficiency of government. He's talking about the anti-federalists. All their claims about liberty, he says, are specious. They're false. What they're really after is to keep their own elite position and their ability to assert power over others. If you really cared about liberty, you'd want a strong government. I've already mentioned this is deeply rooted in the basic Lockean notion. Locke's word about laws, he says, laws ill deserve the name of confinement, which hedges us in only from bogs and precipices, right? Safety rails, guardrails. Laws are the guardrails on the road of society that keep us from going off into the ditch and being wrecked. That's the Lockean model. You can easily see a very direct line here from Hamilton's comments here to modern, say, progressives. The idea that government is a force for good, therefore a vigorous government or a government with a lot of state capacity can do more good, and more particularly the idea that individual liberty only exists when there's strong government to protect it. And if you want a really good example, consider the case of anti-discrimination laws. I mean, you can apply this to lots of things. Rights of contract. I mean, any right, any sense of a right that you have as a private individual to be protected depends on some government enforcement mechanism to protect it. Otherwise, it's not worth much. So I can say you have a right to private property, but if there's no one to protect you from your neighbors coming into your house and taking your stuff, there's no police force, in other words, that right is pretty insecure. And that was Locke's point about life in the state of nature once there's competition. All right, so this is basic liberalism on the one sense, but it's tied to, as Kramnik points out, this emerging modernizing state power idea. That you need a strong, central, developed national state in order for individuals to have the security of private rights in society. And that's a new twist. The other point here is that Hamilton is not only talking about private rights, like security in your private property, but also political rights. He's also, so one danger is from each other. Our private rights are threatened by other private individuals who might steal our stuff or do us violence or infringe on our prerogatives or in other ways piss us off. The other side, the Madisonian side, is the fear of state and local governments. They may become tyrannical. And Hamilton's response to the gauntlet thrown by the Anti-Federalists is to throw it back at them and say, this is all demagoguery and lies. You don't really care about liberty. If you did, you'd want a strong national government. That's the point. What about the claim that Anti-Federalists make that to have a republic, you have to have an homogeneous population? And that won't work in the United States because we are so varied. Jay writes Federalist 2. And I have to say, if you are so inclined, if you want to cast doubt on the Federalist enterprise, right? If you want to say, I am persuaded, or if you are persuaded by the Anti-Federalists, this would be the place for it. Because Jay's description borders on dishonest. Remember, these were written as editorials. It's trying to persuade New Yorkers to approve the Constitution. These are, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but yeah, kind of. And they're political arguments trying to get people to support a position. And Jay goes over, so Jay says, first, the United States has a single geography despite its size. It is physically unified. This is on page 1, paragraph 4 of the excerpt of Federalist 2 that I put up. It has often given me pleasure to observe that independent America was not composed of detached and distant territories. And he goes on to say there's the oceans and the rivers, and it's all very connected, and you can easily get back and forth all over the country. So we all move around, so we all get to know each other. And it's not just geographic, he says. It's also the case that we are a single people. Americans are a single people. With equal pleasure, I have as often taken notice that Providence has been pleased to give this one connected country to one united people. A people descended from the same ancestors, speaking the same languages, professing the same religion, attached to the same principles of government, very similar in their manners and customs, and who by their joint counsels, arms, and efforts fighting side by side through a long and bloody war have nobly established general liberty and independence. Jay is asserting, right? Jay is sort of granting the Anti-Federalist points. Yeah, in order to be a republic, we need to be a single homogeneous people, but good news, we are. Americans are a single people. We all have, and this is clearly false. We all have the same religion. Madison has just finished expostulating at great length about the repression of religious sects in Virginia by the Anglicans. There's no question that there's all kinds of religious conflict and repression going on in the various states because there are multiple religions. There are Anabaptists, and there are Baptists, and there are Congregationalists, and there are Anglicans, and that's just among the Protestant sects who are represented in late 18th century America. So there's something fundamentally dishonest about this. Even weirder, as you're going to see when we get to Federalist 10, Madison is going to take the opposite position. He's going to take the position that we are a complex, pluralistic people with many differences, and this is a good thing. So right there in the Federalist Papers, you have Jay and Madison taking essentially opposite positions in response to this Anti-Federalist challenge, which is something to think about. Jay's trying to rescue the case for a national republic based on traditional criteria. Madison is saying, no, we have a new idea, a new understanding of how republics work that antiquity never recognized, and they're both there in the Federalist Papers, which just points to the danger of trying to say that in this period of time there was a shared single view that everyone agreed on, even among the Federalists, let alone among all Americans. But Jay goes on and doubles down on his claim that we are a single people and therefore a single nation. This country and this people seem to have been made for each other. It appears as if it was the design of Providence that an inheritance so proper and convenient for a band of brethren, united to each other by the strongest ties, should never be split into a number of unsocial, jealous, and alien sovereignties. So Jay's arguing we are a single people. What's artificial are the separation among the states. That's an artificial separation of sovereignty that breaks apart, which would naturally be a single people. Similar sentiments have hitherto prevailed among all orders and denominations of men among us. We have uniformly been one people, each individual citizen everywhere enjoying the same national rights, privileges, and protections. And remember, those are the national rights, privileges, and protections that Hamilton just finished telling us can only be protected by a strong and effective national government. So you can see how these arguments go together. Again, this is preposterous. To say that everyone in the United States, in all the different parts of the United States, has the same set of national rights in 1787. It's aspirational, perhaps, but as a description, it's simply wrong. As a nation, we have made peace and war. As a nation, we have vanquished our common enemies. As a nation, we have formed alliances and made treaties. A strong sense of the value and blessing of union induced the people at a very early period to institute a federal government to preserve and perpetuate it. So Jay is asserting as an empirical statement of fact. Like this is, it's presented as this is just how things are, not as a vision for some distant, misty future. Jay is asserting as a matter of empirical historical fact that all Americans view themselves as a single unified people with a single set of rights as part of a single nation, and therefore we can be a republic, and that any attempt to assert sovereignty on the part of the states is actually a disruption of the republic, is breaking the unity that is essential in any republic. It's divisive. Well, here's Madison and Federalist 10. And as I've already kind of foreshadowed, and you probably already know, you probably read Federalist 10 or looked at it in high school or certainly in college. How many of you have seen Federalist 10 before? Yeah, it's an incredibly famous document. I'll just leave it at that. There's a great deal that could be said about this, but let's not. In Federalist 10, Madison is going to take almost the opposite position. Madison's going to say, no. We are not all the same. We do not all have common interests. We do not have shared sentiments and customs and attitudes, and that's a wonderful thing. That's why our republic will work. That's the new thing that the ancients didn't understand. So what is the danger for all republics? Madison agreeing with Jay, factions. Right? Jay says if you break the republic into states, it's like having factions, using Madison's term. The danger is always factions. Either that a minority will take over and oppress the majority, or the majority will take over and oppress the minority. But either way, it's the division, the lack of unity in a republic that causes them to fall. So he's agreeing with classical Republicans on the starting point. That is, he's agreeing that the problem is disunity and division. The danger for a republic is that essential unity of purpose will be lost. But his solution is wildly different. So what's a faction? By a faction, I understand a number of citizens, whether amounting to a majority or a minority of the whole, who are united and actuated by some common impulse of passion or of interest, adverse to the rights of other citizens or to the permanent and aggregate interests of the community. So a group pursuing its own private gain in a way that is not of benefit to the nation as a whole is a threat to Republican unity. What's the fundamental Republican virtue? Setting the good of the whole always above the good of yourself. That's the basic assumption of Republican thinking from Aristotle all the way up to, pick it, Blackstone. And everywhere in between. That's the fundamental, right? Republicanism is fundamentally a theory of a collective identity in a nation or a state. Well, says Madison, there are two possible ways of dealing with this problem of faction. One is the classical Republican solution, get rid of all differences. If there's one state religion, everyone's educated in one set of schools into one set of principles, right? Classic city-state Republican local rule kind of stuff. But Madison rejects this. And this is where we start to get into some new and strange territory. Because Madison takes what is the starting point for 2,000 years of political theory and dumps it. He says, no, it is not a good solution to make everyone unified and homogeneous and the same. Right? Precisely what Jay claimed was true. To make everyone the same, he says, would destroy liberty. It would end political freedom. Notice, this is very much liberty of the moderns. Right? Have everyone be the same is essential to liberty of the ancients, that model of liberty as collective self-rule. But the liberty of individuals to be free to go about their business and pursue their preferences, that is lost if the government says it's part of its business to make us all the same. Remember that idea of inculcating virtue? The classical Republican idea that liberalism tends to reject? But which shows, leave it at that for the moment, that liberalism rejects. Madison here is taking the liberal side of that argument. But watch carefully, he's going to move back and forth. It would destroy liberty. It would make everyone the same, would end individual freedom, and these would be intolerable. You'd lose both political liberty and individual freedom. So that solution is intolerable. Pluralism is a positive good. We like the fact that we're different. It also doesn't work, says Madison, to say everyone will just serve the common good, make the common good the goal. That doesn't work, says Madison, because once you have individual freedom to pursue your preferences and your interests, you'll have economic inequality. One of the core tenets of classical republicanism was economic equality, right? And the valorization of the middle class, but that there shouldn't be inequality, because if there's inequality, there's divisions of interest, and therefore there's disunity. No, says Madison, this is a great thing. The diversity in the faculties of men, from which the rights of property originate, is not less an insuperable obstacle to uniformity of interests. The protection of these faculties is the first object of government. What does he mean? All right, go back to that Lockean model that Hamilton appealed to. You need strong government to have now individual liberty with a specific reference to property. What's he talking about? He's talking about the freedom of individuals to pursue their own economic interests. And to be able, for individuals to be able to be free to pursue economic interests, you need a strong and complex government system. Just for a few examples, you need enforceable contracts and a body of contract law and a body of property law and institutions to enforce those property rights. You may need things like currencies and regulation of markets. You may decide to have tariffs or not to have tariffs, right? There are all kinds of commercial and mercantilist policies that governments might consider, and getting those right, says Madison, is essential for individuals to have the freedom to pursue their own economic gain, which is a good thing. This is that classic liberalism stuff. It is a good thing that individuals are free to pursue their own interests rather than always subordinating themselves to the general good. We wouldn't really want to have it any other way. Why? Because to have it any other way, you'd have to limit property rights. And one of Madison's great fears is the mob coming to take property away from those who have it. So you can't make everybody the same, because that would be the end of freedom. And you can't tell everyone, well, look, just, we'll tell you what to do so that you're always acting for the common good and for on no other basis. That would also destroy freedom. This liberty of the moderns shatters the idea of rights as a concept as part of the liberty of the moderns, liberty as an individual's freedom of choice, shatters the basic presumption of classical republicanism. So what's the solution, according to Madison? Institutional design. That is, we have to cure the effects of faction. We can't prevent them from occurring, and we don't want to, frankly. So we have to cure their effects. Is the solution to always have the wisest people ruling us? Nah. It is vain to say that an enlightened statesman will be able to adjust these clashing interests and render them all subservient to the public good. Right? Sort of imagine like the planned economy model. We'll put the wisest among us in charge, and they'll have authority to decide who gets to do what and which interests are promoted and which interests are suppressed, all in the name of the common good. That doesn't work, says Madison. That's not possible. So you need an institutional design that will somehow turn the fact of pluralism and factionalism and competing interests into a virtue. Well, if it's a minority faction, we have the solution. Elections. As long as elections are free and fair, this is why the integrity of elections becomes such a big deal. As long as elections are free and fair, again, who gets to vote? Who's the people? You can see how those foundational questions are all packed into these questions. But as long as we have some system of elections that we believe are free and fair, then we can say, if a minority ever were to, the richest people in America were to somehow take over, we could vote them out of office. If a faction consists of less than a majority, relief is supplied by the Republican principle. Here, Republican just means small d Democratic, which enables the majority to defeat its sinister views. It may clog the administration, it may convulse the society, but it will be unable to execute and mask its violence under the forms of the Constitution. And of course, we have lots and lots of modern examples of minority factions exercising their ability to clog the operations of government, right? But what they can't do is institute their own agenda. The most obstructionist congressional minority in the world, no matter how effective its obstructionist tactics might be, doesn't have the ability to affirmatively pass its own legislation and impose its own model on the world. So says Madison, there's a solution. Yeah, these clogs and obstructions might be unfortunate and uncomfortable, but they're never going to be able to take over. So the danger, we're going to come back to that question, by the way. Is he right? Was he right that the United States is not subject to capture by interested minorities? That's a big question. Maybe we'll come back to it. Most political scientists agree he was simply wrong. He was just flat out wrong on that question. Now, there's always been minority control of policymaking in the United States, and that's always been our biggest problem. But we'll have a chance to discuss this as we go forward. But in Madison's view, however, the issue of a minority takeover and minority domination is off the table. You've solved that problem by having elections. So the problem is what happens when the majority wants to oppress a minority. And I'm sure when you read this in high school or talked about it, you heard this phrase, majoritarian tyranny, tyranny of the majority, right? This is Madison's great concern, and it is, based on his observations of the politics of Virginia in the preceding 8 or 9 years, in which the Anglican majority was oppressing the hell out of religious minorities in particular, and the Eastern economic majority was, oppressing might be strong, but acting against the interests of the Western part of the state. So here is where Madison suddenly kind of does a 180. All this time, he's been talking in this modernizing state power liberalism kind of way, right? You don't need people to be homogenous. You don't need to suppress private interest for the common good. You don't, even if you could, you don't want to. It's a bad thing. Suddenly, though, he says, well, the good news is that these elections I talked about, not only are they a check on minority tyranny, they also guarantee that only the most virtuous people will be elected as officials. Madison basically viewed the people as having just enough sense to elect their betters. And his faith was that people would always want to elect, we would always want to elect the best among us to be our representatives and would accurately identify them. And by best, he means most virtuous in a classical Republican kind of sense. So here's this mixed metaphor we talked about. So the point of elections, he says, is to refine and enlarge public views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the true interests of the country, whose patriotism and love of justice will be least likely to sacrifice it. There's a word missing here, sorry. Least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial considerations, right? The people we elect, they will be virtuous. They will seek the national common good. They will not seek to elevate their private interests or a faction's interests or their state's interests above the nation. We will elect, I mean, this is classical republicanism. The difference is, instead of being applied as a description of all citizens, it's applied only as a description of representatives. And that's why representation is such a critical part of Madison's theory, because his theory in Federalist 10 depends on the filter model of representation. The model that says you have a large body of people who are of indifferent virtue, but you use elections as a filter to pick out the very best among them, and they will rule wisely. But you can't rely on that entirely, so you also need another solution, another institutional solution. And here is where Madison becomes most radical. He says the solution is not a small, homogeneous city-state. On the contrary, it's a large, pluralistic, varied state. That is the situation, in fact, in which you can get good government. And his fear, as we talked about last time, is capture. The smaller the government, the more prone it is to being captured by a faction. The smaller the society, the fewer probably will be the distinct parties and interests composing it, right? If you're a classical Republican, yeah, exactly, that's a good thing. No, says Madison, it's a bad thing. The fewer the distinct parties and interests, the more frequently will a majority be found of the same party, and the smaller the number of individuals composing a majority, the more easily they will concert and execute their plans of oppression. Majoritarian capture of government happens easily in small states. A great big state like the United States, that's the solution. And to make the point clearer, Madison is explicit, that's why the national government is a better securer of liberties and rights than the states. Hence, it clearly appears that the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy, that is representative government, with the filter model representation, as opposed to pure direct democracy. Is everybody following all this? I know I'm sort of throwing around some concepts that I haven't explained, but I'm assuming they're familiar to you. So in the same way that having a filter model representation is better than having everybody participate, there's a famous line in here where Madison said, if every Athenian had been a Socrates, the Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. Because it is only through representation, he says, that you can get the beneficial qualities of this filtering. But the same advantage which a republic has over a democracy in controlling the effects of faction is enjoyed by a large over a small republic, and is enjoyed by the union over the states composing it. So if you want liberty, don't look to sovereignty in the states, look to a strong unified national government, and notice in Madison's formulation, the states are constituent elements of the national polity, which is the real thing. Now, there are a slew of assumptions going on here. For example, no fixed national parties. If you read all of Federalist 10, as you've probably done, right, Madison is talking about factions that change. People that unify together, band together temporarily to pursue an interest, and then later when some other issue arises, they'll band with other people to pursue some other interest. This is why, among other things, Madison argues that religion needs to be kept out of politics, because religious lines are fixed. People don't fluidly and easily move back and forth across religions. So you would have the fixed faction problem. Well, of course, after 1800, when we have national political parties, you have massive fixed factions. And somehow Madison appears not to have seen that coming. I've also already pointed to the question, is Madison right that there's no risk of minority capture? Most political scientists who study the question will agree that if you look at policy preferences of Americans and actual government policy of America, there's a really sharp disconnect on a lot of issues. And the reason is, on numerous issues, there's been minority capture. You can make a separate argument about the effects of wealth in politics or something like that. But certainly, the idea that there's no risk of the minority running the agenda seems to have been empirically false. Is Madison assuming that there are no great inequalities of wealth? Right? He talks about the importance of inequality. The importance of letting people pursue their interests so that they can make the most of their faculties. And he talks explicitly that one of the positive outcomes of this will some people be richer and some people be poor. As long as it's a fair system and they get to pursue their talents, right? People have different levels of talent and hard work and whatever it is that leads to wealth. But is he still clinging to some version of a Republican assumption that there won't be massive inequalities of wealth? Inequalities of wealth so great that they translate into fundamental inequalities of political power. Is he assuming a certain degree of political equality among all the participants? You can argue that he is. And finally, Madison appears very, very confident that politics will be based on interests, and particularly economic interests, rather than identity. That's that religion thing again. But of course, religion is not the only basis for identitarian politics. There are lots of bases for identitarian politics, and they've been part of politics since time immemorial. This is ranging from South Carolina's assertion, this is our peculiar institution, because that's just the way we are. This is our way of doing things. A very powerful theme in the first half of the 19th century in Southern writing. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad, slavery is our way, and this is who we are. Racial identitarianism, right, the politics of white supremacy are critical across all areas in this period, but certainly in the slaveholding states. There are lots and lots of bases. Religion, as I've already mentioned, is one. Cultural identity. Jay's assertion that the United States is a single homogeneous mass of people sharing an identical language, religion, culture, customs, and mores is absurd. So it's an interesting thing to look at Federalist 10 and ask how much of it actually holds up. But there is no question that it is that's the word I'm looking for. It's one of the premier articulations of this new Federalist theory, and it's their fundamental response to the anti-Federalists. Everything you know is wrong. Everything you learned from antiquity, from Rome, from Athens, from Florence, it's all wrong. We have discovered a new and deeper truth, and the truth is that republics work best when they are large, representative, and pluralistic, not when they are small, homogeneous, and perfectly unified. All right, that's the theory. What about some of the particular questions that anti-federalists raise, like the powers of the federal government? The anti-federalists said, you will have very powerful federal government, and this will be a bad thing. What's the Federalist response? Federalist 23, here's Hamilton. And Hamilton talks about defense and commerce, specifically, economic regulation and national defense. And in both instances, I mean, this is Hamilton we're talking about, no big surprise. Hamilton insists you have to have a very, very powerful national government to carry out its great tasks. So with regard to defense, for example, these powers ought to exist without limitation, because it is impossible to foresee or define the extent and variety of national exigencies, or the correspondent extent and variety of the means which would be necessary to satisfy them. On questions of defense, says Hamilton, you can't specify what the means are the government can use, because you can't possibly foresee all the different possibilities that will arise. And the national government has to have the power to perform its essential function. And what is true of defense, he says, is equally true of economic regulation. The same must be the case in respect to commerce and to every other matter to which federal jurisdiction is permitted to extend. Not to confer in each case a degree of power commensurate to the end would be to violate the most obvious rules of prudence and propriety. Notice the way he's reasoning here. He's thinking of the Constitution as an expression of ends, purposes. The national government has the following purposes, A, B, C, D, E. And whatever those purposes are, says Hamilton, the national government must have all the powers necessary to achieve them. Otherwise, you have a logical fallacy. To say to someone, go dig a hole and then say, don't use any tools, or it's a weak analogy, right? Go perform a task, but don't use any tools for that purpose, it doesn't make any sense. So Hamilton's view is that the Constitution creates a national government given certain tasks and roles, and the question of what are its powers is subsidiary to that. The answer is whatever is necessary and proper, to coin a phrase, to achieve those goals. It's a very different way of reasoning about what Article 1, Section 8 does. And next time we look at the text, Article 1, Section 8, for those of you who don't know, is the section that lists the powers of Congress, fundamentally the powers of the federal government. It ends with that necessary and proper clause that I just mentioned. And as we read that in our next session, ask yourself, is this a list of powers that can be used for whatever purpose the government wants? Or is it a list of goals and purposes that the government may use its powers to achieve? Or some complicated combination of the two? And by now, my answer always is complicated combination of the two, because I just think things should be as complicated as possible. You don't have to reach that same conclusion, however. But that's Hamilton's argument right here. Well, what about federal-state relations? What happens to the states know this? The great concern of the anti-federalists' writers. Madison responds in Federalist 44. And he says, first of all, notice that there are some limitations on the states. One of them is coining money. This gets to be a long, complicated story. The history of American currency is a great subject. It's just Friedman wrote a Monetary History of the United States, and it's his great academic work before he went off and became something else. When he was, his original scholarly work, Milton Friedman. Really short version, states weren't allowed to coin money, so instead banks did. So the effect of this provision was to privatize the currency system. When we get to the Civil War and talk about greenbacks and the creation of a federal currency, we'll revisit this story a little bit. For the moment, let's just say Madison thought it was important that states not be in the business of coining money and competing with each other, right? So that one state's money would have an exchange rate with another state's money. The same way countries do nowadays, yeah? And you would have the problem, is there a strong or a weak Ohioan dollar or whatever? Treaties and alliances. States can't make treaties and alliances. They can't have bills of attainder. We were ex post facto laws, or laws impairing the obligation of contracts. This is Article 1, Section 9. It is the only part of the Constitution that establishes limitations that apply to states. None of the rights in the Bill of Rights apply to the states at all until the 1920s. I don't know if you knew that, but it's a really kind of critical thing to be aware of. Our constitutional history is 250 years old. Our rights constitution is only 100 years old, except for these three very specific things, which we will talk about more when we get to some cases. But listen to the way Madison explains why these powers are taken away from the states, why the states are prohibited from making these kinds of laws. They are contrary to the first principles of the social compact and to every principle of sound legislation. Pure luck. No one would agree to a social contract in which the created commonwealth would have the power to issue ex post facto laws, impair the obligation of contracts, or issue bills of attainder. Real quick, a bill of attainder is a law that specifies a particular person and basically takes away their property for themselves and their descendants, used by Parliament as punishment for treason or disloyalty to the king. An ex post facto law is something that, short version, punishes something as a crime that wasn't a crime when you did it. So you do something, and after the fact, we declare that's a crime, then go back and punish you for it. And impairment of the obligation of contract, actually, there's a lot of debate about exactly what that meant. But again, Madison's concern is to protect private property rights, not only against private individuals, but against state governments, who we did not trust. What about the powers of, so those are the limits, and also imposts and duties, because you have to have commerce. Right? So those are the limitations on the states. What about the powers of Congress? And here Madison launches into a fascinating discussion. He says, look, we could have chosen to enumerate the powers of Congress. You all learned in high school or middle school, maybe even elementary school, I don't know, the enumerated powers idea, right? You all heard the phrase enumerated powers. Madison denies that the Constitution enumerates federal powers at all. He says the whole idea is wrong. Why? Because there were four alternatives, he said. Congress could have expressly enumerated the powers of the federal government. They could have listed all of the implied powers. They could have listed the unenumerated powers. They said Congress does not have the following powers and tried to list all of them. Or they could have said nothing. Well, none of these quite work, says Madison. What about the express delegation model? That was the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation said that the national government shall have those powers expressly delegated thereto by this document. There's a reason, says Madison, we dropped that word expressly the second time around. Had the convention taken the first method, that is the express enumeration method, of adopting the second article of the Confederation, it is evident the new Congress would be continually exposed, as their predecessors have been, to the alternative of construing the terms expressly with so much rigor as to disarm the government of all real authority. What was the problem? Remember vices? Remember Madison's document, Vices? Vices of the political system of the United States? What was the problem with the national government? It couldn't do things. It couldn't do the things it was instituted to do because it didn't have sufficient powers. And Madison's saying, yeah, and the reason was we use this language of express delegation. So that won't do. Could you list all the implied powers? No, says Madison. That doesn't work. The attempt would have involved a complete digest of laws on every subject to which the Constitution relates. Accommodation, too, not only to the existing state of things, but to all the possible changes which futurity may produce. For in every new application of a general power, the particular power, which are the means of attaining the object of the general power, must always necessarily vary with that object. That last phrase is key. Notice what Madison is doing. He's blurring the distinction between powers and goals. Powers and purposes. He says, look, when you grant a general power, like keep the streets safe. If I give you if you're a government and I say you have the authority to keep the streets safe, that's a general power. And a general power defines a goal, an object, safety on the streets. How do you accomplish that? By exercising various particular powers. We can have guys in uniforms, we can have cars, we can carry guns, whatever, right? Various particular powers have to be assumed and implied in order for the general power, which names a goal, keep the streets safe, to be achievable. So Madison is arguing that what you have in the Constitution are statements of general power, which implied particular powers which cannot be enumerated because, just as Hamilton said, they have to be sufficient to deal with any situation that arises. And we don't know what those will be. Could you list all the excluded powers? Could you say, Congress must not do X, Y, and Z? No, says Madison, that's a bad idea. It's actually more dangerous than not saying anything on the topic. Every defect in the enumeration would be the equivalent to a positive grant of authority. Supposing you thought about federal powers this way. Supposing you looked at the Bill of Rights, which applied to Congress, right? Limited the federal government, was added during the ratification process. We talked about all this. Supposing you said, the federal government must have any power that's not prohibited by the Bill of Rights. Right? What's the problem? The problem is you may have forgotten to prohibit something you really wanted to prohibit. The problem is you've just given the national government a blank check to do all kinds of things, some of which might be terrible. Just because you couldn't come up with all the bad things the government might do and list them all, you left one off, right? You're going to be stuck with a tyrannical government. That is, in Madison's, to use an anachronistic metaphor, no way to run a railroad. If to avoid this consequence, they had attempted a partial enumeration of the exceptions, maybe we say the federal government does not have the power to do A, B, C, D, E, and by the way, probably some other things too, and describe the residue by the general term not necessary or proper, right? What if we just said the federal government can't do A, B, C, or D, and by the way, the government shouldn't be allowed to do anything that is not necessary or proper. Use that as a negative. It must have happened the enumeration will comprehend a few of the accepted powers only, right? There'd be lots of things that weren't listed on that list. And that the unnecessary and improper powers included in the residuum would be less forcibly accepted than if no partial enumeration had been made. What you're going to get is people arguing, well, gee, if it isn't in the Bill of Rights, then there is no such right. Anything not listed in the Bill of Rights isn't a right, and therefore the government can do whatever it wants. The danger, says Madison, is if you list some limitations on government power, you leave open everything else, or at least to imply that you're doing so, and you have to have that argument. What about silence? What about just saying, government should do good stuff, and just leave it at that? No, says Madison, that also doesn't work. That errs too far in the other direction. Had the Constitution been silent on this head, there can be no doubt that all the particular powers requisite as a means of executing the general powers would have resulted to the government by unavoidable implication, right? The Hamiltonian model. You say to the government, you have the following purposes, and you say, and you don't say, but by implication, you therefore have all the powers that are needed to carry out these purposes. Otherwise, it would be like telling people to make bricks without straw, if you're familiar with that biblical story. How many of you have read the Bible? Either one of them. All the way through. One? One and a couple of these. It's a very important text, you know. It gets cited quite a lot. Probably worth your attention. Just a thought. Right, so back to Madison, right? Why is he rejecting the just don't say anything? Why is he rejecting that Hamiltonian approach? Just don't say anything. Just list some goals and let it run. No axiom is more clearly established in law or in reason that wherever the end is required, the means are authorized. Whenever a general power to do a thing is given, every particular power necessary for doing it is included. Had this last method, therefore, the silence method, been pursued, every objection now urged against their plan would remain in all its plausibility. Right? The Anti-Federalists are saying these powers you're listing are too great. Well, if we hadn't listed them, it'd be even worse from your perspective. So Madison's model is similar to Hamilton's, but not identical. Again, don't forget, Hamilton's proposed form of government was a king to serve a lifetime term. So the fact that Hamilton is a great fan of centralized power and authority is not a surprise. Madison is not quite there, although he shares some of that modernizing state power attitude and those liberal convictions about individual freedom to pursue economic self-interest that Hamilton does. But Madison wants to say what we've done is enumerate general powers and left particulars to be determined by implication through this phrase, necessary or proper. That's the balance that we've struck. Now, you know he's going to lose this argument. Right? He loses this argument. There is a Bill of Rights. And for whatever it's worth, Madison was absolutely correct that once there was a Bill of Rights, the argument became, well, if it's not listed in the Bill of Rights, then it's not a limitation on government. Government can do anything that's not explicitly precluded by the Bill of Rights, which is one of several. That's one of the arguments that Madison made against having a Bill of Rights in the first place. Well, more to the states. What about the states feeling miffed about their loss of authority? Right? A lot of the Anti-Federalists were, in general, the single thing that drove the Anti-Federalists most of all was a concern about the loss of sovereignty in the states and the loss of the ability of the states to be, in that old liberty of the ancient sense, self-governing. Our way, our South Carolinian way, our Massachusetts way, our Pennsylvania way, whatever it is. What about that? What's Madison's response? Federalist 45. Well, first of all, says Madison, if you accept everything I've said so far, that argument makes no sense at all. That is, I and my friend Hamilton and my friend Jay, we've been arguing, this is the 45th essay after all, in our previous 44 essays, we've been, and in the document Vices of the Political System of the United States and in debates in Congress, we've been arguing consistently and constantly, we need a national government to achieve essential purposes. We need a strong national government, much more centralized than the one under the Articles of Confederation. Well, if that's true, if you accept that, then this argument about state sovereignty is nonsensical. If the Union, as has been shown, be essential to the security of the people of America, if, in a word, the Union be essential to the happiness of the people of America, is it not preposterous to urge as an objection to a government without which the objects of the Union cannot be attained, that such a government may derogate from the importance of the governments of the individual states? You're arguing in favor of preserving powers of states in ways that would prevent the happiness of the people of the United States. That makes no sense. The whole point of government is to achieve the positive goods, right? So if you're arguing for state sovereignty, but you concede that we'd be better off in various ways for defense purposes, for economic purposes, right? Hamilton's bank, you'd be better off with a national government, then you're contradicting yourself. You're speaking in absurdity. In fact, he says, look, states are the source of the most dangerous kinds of factions. We have seen in all the examples of ancient and modern confederacies the strongest tendency continually betraying itself in the members to despoil the general government. Right? In a confederacy model, each member state takes advantage of the national government and destroys the purpose of the confederacy. That's why we need a single republic. And after all, he says, states are still in charge of the vast majority of day-to-day life. It's not as though the federal government is asserting any authority to regulate the ordinary affairs of private citizens. The state government will have the advantage of the federal government. Whether we compare them in respect to the immediate dependence of the one and the other, the weight of personal influence one will possess, or the powers respectively vested in them. The state governments may be regarded as constituent and essential parts of the federal government. So first of all, the whole federal government is organized by state. By state. The whole federal government is organized by state. Think of the Senate. Think of the processes of electing people to the House. Think of the Electoral College. The whole thing runs on the basis of states. While the latter is no wise essential to the operation or organization of the former. States don't depend on the federal government to organize themselves and run. The dependency runs the other direction. Without the intervention of the state legislatures, the president cannot be elected at all. They must in all cases have a great share in his appointment. The powers reserved to the several states will extend to all the objects which in the ordinary course of affairs concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people. In ordinary daily life, state law will govern what you do. Contracts, just basic laws, employment, buying and selling things, building. All of that's governed by state law. The Constitution has nothing to do with these private law matters. The operations of the federal government will be most extensive and important in times of war, those of state governments in times of peace and security. So Madison's answer is, right, he's trying to have it multiple ways at the same time. On the one hand, you have to have a national government to have prosperity and happiness. If you quite that paragraph, I skipped some lines. But he says the national government is essential to security, it's essential to prosperity, it's essential to efficiency, it's essential to happiness. If all of that is true, he says it's absurd to insist that we should be concerned about prerogatives of the states. But on the other hand, states retain enormous prerogatives, he claims, since they are constitutive of the federal government. And besides, in terms of daily life, in terms of everybody's ordinary life and personal affairs, state law, state courts, state governments are going to govern almost everything they do. So what's the problem? Federalist 51, the other most famous Federalist paper, separation of powers. This is Madison's introduction of the idea of checks and balances. Remember we read last time, Sentinel, I believe it was, arguing against complexity in government. You remember that? You shouldn't have a bicameral legislature. You shouldn't have a complex system of mixed government. Why not? You lose accountability. The point of elections is to have the people know whom to blame for something they don't like, and therefore be able to remove them. That whole small d democratic checking function, according to Sentinel, prominent anti-federalist, is lost if the government becomes too complex, such as the one being proposed for the nation at this time. And I pointed out there are lots and lots of modern examples of this, where Congress does something that is not liked, and the two sides end up pointing fingers and saying, well, it was their fault, right? The two parties, each party claims it was the other party's fault that something happened that is not popular. See, says Sentinel, what's going on there is people don't know whom to hold accountable because your system is too complicated. Well, no, says Madison, that's not a good solution. And the reason that's not a good solution is that Sentinel's simple model of government with a single house of the legislature, for example, as existed in Pennsylvania, and a singular executive, that model leads to too much concentration of power. You need, just as you need multiple factions to check each other, so no one will capture the government, you need checks and balances within the government, so no one piece of the government will capture the entirety of the power of the whole. To what expedient, then, should we finally resort, this is Federalist 51, for maintaining in practice the necessary partition of power among the several departments? The only answer that can be given is that the defect must be supplied by so contriving the interior structure of the government that its several constituent parts, by their mutual relations, may be the means of keeping each other in their proper places. Notice, by the way, we often use a phrase that is wrong. We often use the phrase separation of powers. This is not a theory of separation of powers. It's a theory of overlapping powers. If the powers are truly separate, one branch has no checking effect on the other. To have checks and balances, you need to have overlapping powers such that more than one branch has to be involved in a decision. So you give for example, following a good Hamiltonian approach, you can say, it's debatable, but you can say the president has to have the authority to send the troops out to perform military missions at his own discretion. Okay, but Congress controls the money. Doesn't order anything he wants. Congress can say no dollar shall be spent on this purpose, and it's over. And that model goes on, right? You're all familiar with checks and balances. This is not a foreign audience I'm talking to. All right. So the most famous phrase, of course, we must set ambition to counter ambition. Notice here again, Madison is not relying on virtue in elected officials. Suddenly he's going back to saying, well, we'll assume we have non-virtuous officials, but design it in such a way that it will work anyway. Ambition must be made to counter ambition. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of government, but what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. The fundamental Lockean insight: government exists to protect us from each other. If we are all perfectly peaceful, as in the if you've read the if you've read the Second Treatise, in the pre-economic version of the state of nature, everyone was peaceable. Then money gets invented, and it screws everything up because the natural law against waste goes by the wayside. But if we were still in that peaceable situation, yeah, we wouldn't need government, but we're not. And he says, contrary to Sentinel, that if you want to secure liberty, you precisely do need a complicated government, mixed and complex. In the compound Republic of America, the power surrendered by the people is first divided between two distinct governments, that's federal and state, and then the portion allotted to each subdivided among distinct and separate departments. In Madison's view, federalism is part of checks and balances. The concern always is to prevent capture, prevent excessive concentration of power in a single individual or group, such that they are able to oppress the others. Well, I mentioned the idea of the president having authority to do things unilaterally when they're necessary, and I mentioned that that's a Hamiltonian position to take. He's not the only one, but he's famous for having this particular view. And here he is, talking about the need for energy in the executive on Federalist 70. So if we buy Madison's argument, we buy the need for checks and balances, okay, now we have to actually decide how to distribute the powers. We have overlapping powers within the government, so there's checks and balances. I've mentioned the power of the purse as one example, where Congress has a checking authority on the president, but there's a lot of questions left, of course, to figure out. So Hamilton's going to start with, okay, how should we allocate powers to the executive? And Hamilton's answer is that the executive has to be, in his words, energetic. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws. The protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations, which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice. Just note the emphasis on individual property rights again. The security of liberty against the enterprises and assaults of ambition, of faction, and of anarchy. By contrast, says Hamilton, if we make the executive too weak, our nation will be enfeebled. A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution. And a government ill-executed, whatever it may be in theory, must be in practice a bad government. If you make the executive too weak, you make the national government too weak. If you make the national government too weak, it's a bad government no matter what your governing theory is. You blew it in the execution. So we should have a single executive. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man. There was a debate. If you remember, we saw Brutus, I believe, one of the anti-federalists said we should have three, remember? A three-person executive council from the different regions of the country. No, says Hamilton. We should have a single president because of this need for dispatch and decision and energy. And he adds, this is not in the book, but I put it in the notes for you, right, reprising that theme that a strong government is the guarantor of liberty. He comes back to the specific case of the executive and says, look what happened in Rome. They didn't have a strong executive, a single person possessed of these authorities and powers. So what happened when there was an emergency? They would appoint a dictator. For those of you who don't know, in the Roman system, dictators served for a limited 2-year term. During the period of that term, they had essentially absolute authority. At the end of that time, they were expected to step down. It was an emergency measure designed to cope with security problems. When Julius Caesar declined to step down, he declared himself dictator for life, and that's where that phrase comes from. So when you have people to this day, like in Latin America, for example, it's a very common phrase to hear. Someone declares that I am dictator for life, knowingly or not, they're quoting Caesar, and they're quoting a statement from a system in which the dictator position was supposed to be temporary, and someone was making it permanent. Hamilton says, look, you wouldn't have that problem if you had a decently designed executive in the first place. Every man the least conversant in the Roman story knows how often that republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man under the formidable title of dictator, as well as against the intrigues of ambitious individuals who aspire to the tyranny, and seditions of whole classes of the community, right? Factions, ambitious individuals, all the dangers by which republics are beset. As against the invasions who threaten the existence of all government, as against the invasions of external enemies who menace the conquest and destruction of Rome. All right, so it's clear that representation and who will be the elected representatives, right, is critically important to this whole discussion. Madison is kind of waffling on it. He kind of, in one place in Federalist 10, he says, isn't this great? With a big republic, we'll have this filter function and only the very best, most virtuous people will be elected to office. But then he turns around in Federalist 51 and says, well, you can't really assume that they'll be virtuous, so we better have ambition to counter ambition. And Madison's sort of trying to have it both ways. Hamilton has said, well, the president needs to be a single individual with lots of energy and lots of authority, right? So, and he's a representative, so specific qualities of representatives. What is the Federalist understanding of representation at work here? And here's Hamilton's version. The Republican principle demands that the deliberate sense of the community should govern the conduct of those to whom they entrust the management of their affairs. So first, small d democracy. The representatives work for the people, and their job is to carry out the will of the people. But it does not require an unqualified complaisance to every sudden breeze of passion. But that doesn't mean representative government to respond to every shift in the polls, or every change in public view, or every temporary fashion, to use his term, to every transient impulse. It is a just observation that the people commonly intend the public good. This often applies to their very errors. So first of all, we accept the principle of representative government, that the representatives answer to the people, but that doesn't mean the direct instruction model that the Anti-Federalists had favored. The different model. And why? Because even if we assume the people intend the common good, sometimes they're just wrong. So another filter model. Representatives should be both more virtuous and, for want of a better word, smarter. Their good sense would despise, that is the people's good sense, would despise the adulator who should pretend that they always reason right about the means of promoting it, that is, the public good. They know from experience they sometimes err. And the wonder is that they so seldom err as they do, beset as they continually are by the wiles of parasites and sycophants, by the snares of the ambitious, the avaricious, the desperate. I just love this prose. Okay, look, Hamilton really needed an editor, but sometimes he hits beautiful sentences. Artificers of men who possess their confidence more than they deserve it, and of those who seek to possess rather than to deserve it. Right, so going all the way back to Aristotle, you have the danger of democracy as demagogues. People who will play on the fears or the concerns or insecurities of the people and get them to grant power to that individual. People who will manipulate. I can't do better than him. Parasites, sycophants, the snares of the ambitious, the avaricious, the desperate, and the artifices of men who possess the people's confidence more than they deserve it. Right? So you need, says Hamilton, an elite model of representation. The people are constantly being tempted by demagogues and liars and con artists and sycophants and all this long list of bad things, yeah? So we need to make sure that we have a system in place such that the people will choose the best among us to serve as our representatives. When occasions present themselves in which the interests of the people are at variance with their inclinations, it is the duty of the persons whom they have appointed to be the guardians of those interests to withstand the temporary delusion. It is the job of an elected representative to say to the constituents, you're wrong. You mean well, but you're wrong. What you're asking me to do is against your interests. I will do what serves your actual interests, which I understand better than you do at this moment. It's a theory of representation. Have you heard the trustee-delegate version of representation? This is a trustee model. For those of you who aren't familiar, it's not important. But the model is representatives are elite members of society who have the wisdom to do what's best, even if the people who elected them don't necessarily recognize that, and they have a duty to do so. Again, radically different from the anti-federalist version of representation that we looked at last time. What about courts? So the fascinating thing last time we saw in the discussion of courts, especially Brutus, letters 11 and 12, was how much Brutus accurately anticipated modern practices of court-developed jurisprudence, judicial supremacy, substantive judicial review, all those things. He thought they were bad things. He was against them. But he had no trouble seeing that Article 3 opened the door to all those things. Here's Hamilton's response. And Hamilton, like Madison before him, wants to have it both ways. So this is Federalist 78. So he's first going to say, look, courts aren't that powerful and dangerous anyway. What are you worried about? But then he's going to come back and describe a role for the courts that is frankly breathtaking. So first, the first part. Very famous phrase, the least dangerous branch. Whoever attentively considers the different departments of power must perceive that in a government in which they are separate from each other, the judiciary, from the nature of its functions, will always be the least dangerous to the political rights of the Constitution. Though individual oppression may now and then proceed from the courts of justice, that is, a lawsuit may come out with a wrong outcome, the general liberty of the people can never be endangered from that quarter. So, right? The main point is the legislature. The main point is the laws the government makes. That's where the action is. That's what you should pay attention to. Stop worrying so much about this courts. But then he turns around and connects the role of the courts to his theory of representation. And here's where we'll end. But I think it's absolutely fascinating. So remember that Brutus, when he talked about the role of the court that the courts would take on, he talked about courts invalidating legislation, that the federal legislature would have to follow the court's guidance on what is constitutional. His explanation was because, after all, the Constitution is the source of that power, and no one to whom authority is delegated can act beyond the scope of that delegation. The Latin term is ultra vires, which is not important. Right? But remember, Brutus went through that line of analysis, which we're going to see again in some of the court cases. And he said, so by the nature of the thing, by the nature of this thing called the Constitution, since the powers of the federal government come from the Constitution, the other branches of the federal government must follow the dictates of the courts in terms of figuring out what those grants of powers mean. And he went on to say, we can expect that these powers will be interpreted very broadly. And he had that whole thing about how there would be jurisprudence. There'd be the development over time of principles that the courts would apply and so on. You remember all that? All right. Here's Hamilton's version. There is no position, so we start with the basic premise. Right? The federal government can't have powers that aren't delegated to it, so the Constitution is superior to ordinary lawmaking. There is no position which depends on clear principles, that every act of a delegated authority, contrary to the tenor of the commission under which it is exercised, is void. Right? You hire someone to do something, they do something else, that's a violation of the contract. Basic principle. Okay? To deny this is to affirm the deputy is greater than his principal. Basic principle. All right. How does this play into representation in the courts? It is not otherwise to be supposed that the Constitution could intend to enable the representatives of the people to substitute their will to that of their constituents. Notice, he just finished saying, well, I skipped some papers, but he had recently finished saying that representatives have to be trustees, have to be wise, have to do what's in the people's interest, not what the people say they want. But he's now turning around saying, yeah, but there's a limit to that. And the limit is only insofar as that wisdom is being exercised to carry out the purposes for which they were elected in the first place. It's not an invitation to representatives to say, who cares what the people are about? I want to do things this way. It is far more rational, says Hamilton, to suppose the courts were designed to be an intermediate body between the people and the legislature, in order, among other things, to keep the latter within the limits assigned to their authority. And if you look at the last two quotations in the notes, you'll see Hamilton explicitly embracing strong substantive judicial review, the authority to strike down acts of other branches of the government, and his dismissal of the argument that courts could end up becoming too powerful, and judges might import their own preferences rather than simply applying the law. He says that proves too much. Any power can be misused. That's no reason not to create it in the first place. So Federalist 78 famously starts out by saying, don't worry about courts, they're harmless, but ends by describing a role for federal courts of being the mediators between the people and the representatives. And to dictate, he isn't just talking about violation of the Constitution. He's talking about courts playing a role in saying to government, you are exceeding your mandate as a representative government, and we, the courts, are telling you to stop it, which is remarkable. As in many of Hamilton's ideas, no one took it quite this far. No one wanted his king. No one has taken the version of judicial review as far as he seems to imply in this particular text. But it is very strong. This plus the Brutus essays that we read are very clear indications that nothing was particularly unexpected about the prospect that the meaning of the Constitution, the determination of the meaning of the Constitution would reside in the courts, and that would be a check on the limit. That would be the defining limitation of the authority of the national government that the Constitution had created. All right. It's a little weird to read this before the text, but I think it works anyway. On Thursday, we will read the actual text of the Constitution. Please read it from beginning to end. It's very short. The Constitution of India is more than 350 pages long. If this were a course on the Indian Constitution, this would be an unfair reading assignment. Our Constitution is about 24 paragraphs. You can handle it. See you next time.